Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something you might not expect from ancient Egypt: food. We've all seen those grand feasts depicted in movies and documentaries, but guess what? The reality of what ancient Egyptians actually ate is a whole different story. It wasn't all golden plates of delicacies. Most Egyptians weren't dining on lavish spreads, and if you're expecting a menu full of exotic spices and gourmet dishes, you might want to rethink that. You probably won't survive this reality check, but don't worry, it's not all bad news. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's kick things off with the basics of what most Egyptians were eating day to day. You might have pictured grand banquets or tables laden with exotic foods, but the reality for most people was far less glamorous. The Egyptian diet, for the majority of the population, was rooted in necessity rather than indulgence. Bread, beer, and a few vegetables made up the core of their meals, and even then, they had to make do with whatever the land and Nile could provide. Most of their food came from simple, locally grown ingredients. Wheat and barley were staples, and if you were lucky enough to live near the Nile, you had access to fish as a regular protein source. But let's be real, even their bread wasn't anything like the artisan loaves you see in modern bakeries. It was more of a thick, dense loaf, often served with a side of gritty, unrefined flour. Historians still argue about how much actual flavor these meals had, but it wasn't the kind of food that would win any culinary awards. Now, dim the lights and settle in, because we're about to dive deeper into just how these basic foods played a role in the daily lives of Egyptians. As you settle back in, let's talk about the real backbone of the Egyptian diet: grains. Bread and beer were, hands down, the most common food items on every table, regardless of social status. If you think your weekly trip to the bakery is a must, imagine it being a daily necessity just to get through the day. But here's the twist: this wasn't the gourmet stuff. It wasn't fresh, fluffy loaves of white bread, no. It was more like a heavy, coarse, whole-grain bread made from barley and emmer wheat. You'd probably struggle to get it down without a bit of beer to wash it down. Beer, by the way, wasn't the luxury drink it's become today. For most Egyptians, beer was a staple, a kind of liquid bread that served as both a source of hydration and sustenance. Historians say that beer was often consumed in large quantities, much like water. And while we might picture a cold pint of craft brew, these ancient Egyptian brews were thick, almost porridge-like, and not the kind of drink you'd sip in your modern beer garden. If you wanted a sweet, smooth drink, that wasn't happening. Beer was essential to the everyday Egyptian, and in fact, there are records that show it was given to workers, especially those building the pyramids, as part of their rations. It's not all doom and gloom, though. Bread and beer provided enough to get by. But don't expect any gourmet toppings. No avocado toast, no olive oil dip, just plain, heavy loaves and hearty sips of barley beer. Historians still argue about the actual nutritional value of these meals, but one thing's clear: these basic grains kept ancient Egyptians alive and functioning, even if their meals weren't Instagram-worthy. As you're picturing this, don't forget that while you might struggle to imagine life on this diet, it was a reality for most people in Egypt for thousands of years. Now, let's take a closer look at something that's often overlooked: the humble vegetables. Now that you're imagining the daily bread and beer life of the Egyptians, let's move on to something that might surprise you: vegetables. If you've ever pictured a lush array of fresh veggies on an ancient Egyptian dinner plate, think again. The reality is that vegetables weren't a major part of the average Egyptian's diet. In fact, for most of the population, vegetables were limited to only a few basic varieties, and they didn't exactly provide a rainbow of colors or nutrients. The most common vegetable? Leeks. Yes, leeks, and perhaps a bit of garlic or onions. Historians still argue whether these vegetables were actually more of a garnish or an essential part of a meal. But don't expect salads piled high with leafy greens or roasted carrots with a dash of cumin. These vegetables were seen more as flavor enhancers rather than main components of the meal. Some wealthy Egyptians might have had access to a slightly wider variety, but it was hardly the farm-to-table experience we're used to today. Beyond the few vegetables that made it to the table, ancient Egyptians also had access to some legumes, like lentils and chickpeas, but again, these were typically a luxury reserved for the wealthier classes. The majority of the population, especially those living in rural areas, ate a very limited variety of plant-based foods. So while you might have expected a vegetable garden fit for a king, it was more like a sparse collection of edible essentials, just enough to get by. But here's a quirky tidbit: ancient Egyptians did grow a small amount of cabbage, but it wasn't actually eaten in the way we think of cabbage today. Instead, it was often used in religious rituals or as a medicinal herb. So, no cabbage rolls or coleslaw for the average Egyptian. With all this in mind, it's no surprise that most Egyptians had to make do with very little variety when it came to their daily meals. Now, let's talk about a much rarer luxury: fruit. Now, imagine you're in ancient Egypt, trying to get your hands on something sweet, something that isn't bread or beer. You might be wondering, where's the fruit? Well, here's where things get interesting. While fruit wasn't an everyday staple for the average Egyptian, it was still something they could get their hands on, but usually only during certain seasons or through trade. Let's start with the most common fruit: dates. Dates were the go-to sweet treat for the Egyptians, and they were used in everything from desserts to daily snacks. In fact, dates were so essential that they became a major part of their diet, especially for the workers who were building the pyramids. Some even say dates were used to sweeten beer, giving that thick, barley brew just a hint of natural sweetness. But outside of dates, the fruit selection was rather sparse. You'd be lucky to find figs or pomegranates in your daily ration, and these were more likely to be enjoyed by the wealthier Egyptians. Now, here's a curious tidbit: the ancient Egyptians also ate melons, specifically watermelons. But here's the kicker: most of these melons weren't the sweet, refreshing varieties we munch on during summer picnics today. They were a lot more bitter, and historians still debate whether they were eaten for enjoyment or simply as a form of hydration. The idea of eating a melon that tastes more like a cucumber probably doesn't appeal to you, but for the Egyptians, it was likely an important water source in the arid climate. However, one thing's for sure: the fruit you'd find in ancient Egypt wasn't as sweet, juicy, or diverse as the bounty we have today. Historians argue that due to the limited access to fruit, it wasn't nearly as integral to the diet as it is in modern-day meals. So, no peaches, no apples, and definitely no berry smoothies, just a few seasonal treats that were often a luxury for the rich. With all this talk of scarcity, you might be wondering, what did the average Egyptian do when they wanted to get some protein? Time to dive into the world of meat. Alright, so far, we've covered grains, veggies, and the limited fruit situation, but what about meat? If you were an average Egyptian living centuries ago, meat wasn't exactly on the daily menu. The reality is that most Egyptians didn't have meat at every meal. In fact, meat was reserved for special occasions, sacrifices, and royal feasts. For the average person, it was a rare treat, mostly consumed during festivals or as part of religious ceremonies. If you were lucky enough to have some, it usually came from domesticated animals like sheep, goats, or cattle, but these were far from a regular source of protein. You'd probably see meat on the table during a major celebration, perhaps a successful harvest or an important religious festival. But for most of the population, meat was an extravagance, and not something you'd expect to see every week. In fact, records show that ancient Egyptians ate meat mostly on feast days, with the poorer classes rarely getting a taste. So, imagine getting a small chunk of meat just once in a while, maybe on a special holiday, and mostly relying on fish, bread, and whatever vegetables were available to fill you up. But here's something interesting: if you lived near the Nile River, your diet was a bit different. Fish became a more regular part of the meal plan, especially for those who lived in the Nile Delta region. Fish wasn't as scarce as meat, but it still wasn't the fresh, premium quality you'd expect today. The fish was often dried or salted to preserve it, so while it was technically available more often, it wasn't exactly fresh sushi. And forget about the delicate white fish fillets you might find at a fine dining restaurant today. The fish eaten by ancient Egyptians would have been much more basic, probably prepared with just a few simple spices and served as a basic source of protein. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians were more dependent on fish or meat, but one thing's clear: it wasn't the luxurious, meat-heavy diet we often imagine ancient civilizations enjoyed. The reality was much more humble, with fish often serving as the default choice when meat wasn't on the table. Now that we've covered the basics of protein, let's take a step back and look at a real anomaly in the Egyptian diet: dairy. Spoiler alert, it wasn't quite the milk and cheese-loving society you might expect. Let's take a moment to talk about something a bit surprising: dairy. Now, when you think of a typical diet today, milk, cheese, and yogurt are probably staples in many homes. But in ancient Egypt, dairy didn't have the same presence. In fact, most Egyptians didn't drink milk at all. Historians still debate why milk wasn't a significant part of their diet. Some believe it was a cultural preference, while others think it had to do with practicality. Cows, after all, were valuable for their strength and ability to work the land, so they weren't kept primarily for their milk. And when it came to dairy products like cheese or butter, well, those weren't common either. Interestingly, milk wasn't something that was regularly consumed, especially by the lower classes. Only the wealthier Egyptians might have had access to milk in limited quantities, but it wasn't part of the daily routine. There's even evidence to suggest that many Egyptians viewed dairy products with suspicion, possibly due to the lack of refrigeration. That fresh glass of milk you're picturing? It was more likely to spoil quickly in the hot Egyptian climate, and so it wasn't often incorporated into meals. But here's the kicker: Egypt had a rich history of brewing. Beer was much more common and consumed in much larger quantities than milk. If you wanted something to drink, you probably reached for a mug of beer rather than a glass of milk. And while it might sound strange to us, beer was considered much more of a safe drink. It had been fermented, so it was easier to drink safely without worrying about contamination. Milk, on the other hand, was harder to preserve and harder to keep fresh. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians ever figured out the art of dairy farming, but the consensus is that it wasn't a food group they depended on for their nourishment. The Egyptians lived largely without milk, and while cheese might have made an appearance on occasion, it wasn't the central part of their diet that we see in today's world. So, if you're wondering what ancient Egyptians would have snacked on, the answer is probably not a cheese platter. Instead, their snacks would have been a lot more basic. But now that we've covered the limitations of dairy, let's talk about something even more elusive: sweets. Alright, we've covered the basics: grains, vegetables, fruits, protein, and dairy. But now let's talk about something you probably expected to see more of in the diet of ancient Egypt: sweets. When you picture ancient feasts, surely you imagine some kind of decadent dessert. Something rich and sugary, right? Well, the reality of ancient Egyptian sweets is a bit of a letdown if you've got a sweet tooth. Sugar, as we know it today, didn't exist in the ancient world. In fact, the first widespread use of sugar didn't come until much later, so don't expect anything resembling chocolate cake or syrup-drenched waffles on the Egyptian menu. So, if you were craving something sweet in ancient Egypt, your options were extremely limited. The closest thing they had to a dessert was honey, and that wasn't available to just anyone. Honey was a luxury and could only be afforded by the wealthy or those involved in trade. But even honey wasn't used for the kinds of sweets we might expect. It was often used to sweeten drinks or as a glaze for meats. And while some fruits like dates were a natural source of sweetness, these were often more of a snack than a dessert. The idea of a chocolate mousse or a custard pie? Not even close. What about pastries? Unfortunately, pastries as we know them didn't exist in ancient Egypt either. Any dough-based treats were often heavy, dense, and barely sweet at all. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians had any true form of dessert or if their sweet indulgences were simply fruits and honey combined into a small treat. So, if you're thinking of indulging in sweet treats like we do today, ancient Egypt is not your place for it. In fact, the lack of sweets probably made everything else, the grains and bread, feel like the highlight of the meal, at least for those who were lucky enough to eat them. Now that we've covered the sugar-free world of ancient Egypt, let's talk about something that did get plenty of attention: drinks. The most popular beverage? Well, it wasn't juice or soda, but something that would definitely surprise you. Now that we've addressed the sweetness deficit, let's move on to a drink that played a far more significant role in the daily life of ancient Egyptians: beer. Yes, beer. If you thought they were sipping fine wines like in Roman times, think again. Beer wasn't just a casual drink, it was essentially the ancient Egyptian equivalent of water. In fact, it was so common that it was consumed by people from all walks of life, including workers, children, and even the elderly. It wasn't just for the wealthy elite. Beer was essential for survival. But let's set the record straight, it wasn't the smooth, crisp beer you're probably imagining. Egyptian beer was thick, almost porridge-like, and had a far higher yeast content than anything brewed today. Historians describe it as more of a chunky liquid than a clear, cold brew. Think of it as a liquid bread, rich, thick, and dense. People often drank it with their meals or as a meal itself. Workers building the pyramids were regularly provided with beer rations as part of their daily sustenance, which may sound like a luxury, but when it was your only form of hydration, it made sense. Beer was typically made from barley and was sometimes sweetened with dates or other fruits. But don't expect the flavor to match the cold, hoppy beer you're used to. The beer brewed by the Egyptians had a much more complex, fermented taste that required a specific acquired taste, probably not something you'd want to sip on a sunny afternoon while lounging by the pool. Historians still argue about the exact nature of ancient Egyptian beer. Was it more of a nutritional necessity than a recreational drink? We may never know for sure, but one thing is clear: it was a staple of the Egyptian diet, and its consumption was integral to both daily life and religious rituals. Now, after all that beer talk, you're probably wondering, did ancient Egyptians add any other flavors to their meals? Enter the spice rack, or rather, the lack thereof. Now that we've cleared up the beer situation, let's talk about something that might sound a little underwhelming: spices. When you think of ancient civilizations and their food, you might picture a rich variety of spices: cumin, coriander, cinnamon, spreading across the table. But for the ancient Egyptians, the spice game was more of a sparse sprinkle than a full-on culinary explosion. Their spices were simple and not nearly as extensive as what we enjoy today. If you're imagining a bold curry or a perfectly spiced stew, you're going to be disappointed. Ancient Egyptians used a few basic spices, mostly coriander, cumin, and dill. These were used primarily for flavoring the bread or fish, but they weren't at the forefront of the diet like spices are in modern cuisine. A pinch of cumin here, some coriander there. But don't expect anything too adventurous. Egyptians didn't have access to the vast range of spices that we take for granted today. Here's a fun, and slightly quirky, fact: they also used garlic and onions, which were considered medicinal as well as flavorful. These vegetables had a special place in Egyptian culture, not just for taste, but also for their supposed health benefits. Garlic, for example, was thought to be a cure for a range of ailments, from digestive issues to even protecting the heart. In fact, workers who built the pyramids were regularly given garlic to keep them healthy and energized, not to mention ward off those pesky stomach bugs. So while garlic wasn't exactly a spice, it played a pivotal role in Egyptian kitchens. Historians still argue about how heavily spiced ancient Egyptian meals really were. Some believe that spices and herbs were reserved for religious or ceremonial occasions, while others suggest that these flavors were just another part of everyday life, albeit in moderation. Regardless, the ancient Egyptian spice cupboard wasn't nearly as varied as the one in your kitchen today. No exotic blends, no tantalizing curries, just a few simple ingredients. With the food flavors down to a bare minimum, you might be wondering about another important aspect of ancient life: food rituals. After all, ancient Egyptians were known for their spiritual practices, and it turns out that food was deeply intertwined with their religious beliefs. Now, let's explore something a little more profound: the role of food in the ancient Egyptian religion. Food wasn't just something to fill your stomach in ancient Egypt, it was imbued with deep spiritual meaning. Every meal, every offering, had a connection to the gods, the afterlife, and cosmic balance. Eating wasn't merely for survival, it was part of the eternal cycle that governed Egyptian life. The Egyptians practiced many rituals that involved food, particularly as offerings to their gods. In fact, food was often seen as a way to communicate with the divine. Temples were stocked with breads, fruits, and meats that were offered to deities. The idea was that by giving food to the gods, they would receive blessings in return, whether it was for a bountiful harvest or protection from harm. These offerings were made with great reverence, and the food was often placed in carefully arranged ritualistic patterns. Interestingly, food didn't just play a role in religious offerings, it was also part of funerary rituals. The ancient Egyptians believed that the soul of the deceased would need food and drink in the afterlife to sustain them. This belief led to the creation of elaborate tombs filled with food offerings for the dead. Sometimes, these offerings were placed directly in the tombs of pharaohs, ensuring that they would be well fed in their journey to the afterlife. The most famous tomb to contain such offerings is the tomb of Tutankhamun, which had provisions for food, drink, and even bread to accompany the young king in his eternal rest. Historians still debate the exact nature of the food-related rituals in Egypt. Were these offerings a genuine belief in the gods' need for food, or were they symbolic gestures meant to ensure prosperity? The rituals were elaborate, but the specifics of their meaning remain a bit of a mystery. The spiritual connection to food also extended to the way Egyptians prepared their meals. Cooking wasn't just about combining ingredients, it was a process that, in some ways, mirrored the rituals of the gods. For instance, the baking of bread was seen as a sacred task, and certain methods of food preparation were believed to maintain the balance of order and chaos, key themes in Egyptian spirituality. So, next time you sit down for a meal, think about how food in ancient Egypt wasn't just about satisfying hunger, it was part of something much bigger, deeply tied to their beliefs, their gods, and the afterlife. With food being such an integral part of their rituals and religious life, what about those who were on the other side of the social hierarchy? What did the elite have for their meals? We're about to dive into the lavish feasts of the pharaohs and the wealthy elite. Now that we've seen how food intertwined with religion, let's take a step up the social ladder and see what the wealthy Egyptians were feasting on. The pharaohs and their elite weren't living on bread and beer alone. While the common people scraped by with grains and a sparse selection of vegetables, the privileged few dined on a much more extravagant spread. Their meals were packed with luxurious items that the average Egyptian could only dream of. At the grand feasts of the pharaohs, meats like duck, goose, and even wild animals such as antelope and gazelle were served. These meats were cooked in a variety of ways, including roasting and stewing, and were often accompanied by breads that were finer and lighter than the dense loaves most people ate. And if you think these banquets were just about food, think again, these were occasions that displayed power and wealth. The food was just one part of an elaborate display of luxury and abundance meant to assert the pharaoh's authority over the land and the people. Historians debate just how often these grand feasts took place, with some suggesting that they were primarily ceremonial, reserved for important religious festivals, military victories, or diplomatic events. But whenever they happened, you can bet they were nothing short of lavish. Banquets were often held in palaces or temples, with the finest foods prepared by skilled chefs who had access to rare and exotic ingredients. Spices, fruits, and sweet treats, things that the average Egyptian might never see, were all part of these elite gatherings. And don't forget the beverages. While beer was a staple for most Egyptians, wine was reserved for the wealthy. They drank wine made from local grapes or imported from other regions, and it was often served during banquets alongside bread and roasted meats. Wine wasn't just a drink, it was a symbol of status, something you'd only find at a wealthy table. Interestingly, while the elites enjoyed more variety, the quality of the food wasn't always on par with modern expectations. The meats might have been richer, but they weren't necessarily better prepared. Even the pharaohs didn't have access to the kind of culinary finesse we take for granted today. It was a world where status was measured by what was available, not necessarily by taste. Now that we've explored the lavish dining of the elite, let's take a closer look at the other side of the coin, the workers who toiled day in and day out, building the wonders of Egypt. What did their meals look like? Let's shift gears and head down to the other end of the social spectrum, the workers. While the pharaohs were living it up with their feasts and fine wines, the laborers, those who actually built the pyramids, temples, and grand monuments, were living on a much simpler, less glamorous diet. But don't imagine they were just subsisting on bread and water alone. Their meals, while basic, were designed to fuel them for the grueling work they did every day. The workers were provided with rations that consisted mainly of bread and beer, just like the majority of the population. However, they didn't always have access to the same high-quality bread that the elite enjoyed. The bread they ate was often made from coarser flour, sometimes mixed with bran, giving it a denser, more fibrous texture. To wash it down, they had the same thick, porridge-like beer that most Egyptians drank. It wasn't exactly refreshing, but it was filling and packed enough nutrients to keep the workers going through the long, hot days. But there were a few perks for these workers, believe it or not. While meat was rare for the average person, the laborers who worked on the pyramids and other large projects were sometimes given meat as part of their rations. However, this wasn't a regular occurrence. The meat they received often came from slaughtered animals, like cattle or sheep, but it was more of a supplement rather than a main part of their diet. In fact, it was more common for workers to receive fish as their source of protein. Fish from the Nile, particularly tilapia, was a more frequent protein source because it was cheaper and easier to catch than land animals. In addition to bread, beer, and occasional fish or meat, the workers' diet sometimes included onions, leeks, and garlic, simple vegetables that were easy to grow and provide essential nutrients. These vegetables were often eaten raw, or added to stews, if they had the luxury of making one. The workers would have also eaten dates, as these were relatively inexpensive and provided a sweet and calorie-dense snack. Historians still argue over whether the workers' rations were truly enough to sustain them for the hard labor they performed. Some suggest that the diet was sufficient, while others believe the workers might have been underfed, with the food only just keeping them alive and capable of working. Regardless, the reality is that the workers' meals were simple, functional, and far from luxurious. Now, as we've seen, food in ancient Egypt wasn't just about sustenance, it was shaped by social status, religious beliefs, and survival. But what about the larger picture of food scarcity and the limitations that ancient Egyptians faced in acquiring food? Let's zoom out and take a look at the factors that influenced what, when, and how they ate. As we've seen, food in ancient Egypt was closely tied to social class, religion, and necessity. But beyond all that, there were also real, practical limitations when it came to what Egyptians could actually put on the table. Despite the mighty Nile River and the fertile land, food scarcity was a real concern for many. The agriculture that sustained Egypt's population was entirely dependent on the annual flooding of the Nile, which brought the nutrients necessary for crops to thrive. But if the flood didn't come at the right time, or if it was weaker than usual, the effects were devastating. In years when the Nile didn't flood as expected, the entire agricultural system could be thrown into disarray. Crops might fail, and food would become scarce. This was a serious issue, especially for the lower classes who already had limited access to a varied diet. The concept of food security was virtually non-existent, and the population often had to rely on stored grain to survive lean years. Historians still argue about the extent of food shortages in ancient Egypt, but it's clear that food scarcity was a recurrent issue that led to famines from time to time. To make matters worse, Egypt's climate was incredibly hot and dry. Despite the fertility of the Nile River, much of the land was arid and unsuitable for growing crops without irrigation. This meant that food production was vulnerable to changes in weather patterns, making the Egyptians highly dependent on the cycles of nature. When the flood was bountiful, the land produced enough food to sustain the population, but during poor flooding years, things could get much more difficult. In these tough times, food didn't just become scarce, it became more expensive. Even the simple foods like bread and beer, which were usually affordable, could skyrocket in price, pushing them out of reach for many people. The result? Rationing, food shortages, and hunger for the poor. This stark contrast between the abundance of food during good years and the hardship during bad ones only deepened the divide between the rich and poor in ancient Egyptian society. Historians still debate how often these food crises occurred and how the Egyptian government handled them. Some suggest that the pharaohs implemented systems of food storage and distribution to help during famines, but it's clear that food was always an unstable commodity. No matter how powerful Egypt's civilization seemed, it was still subject to the whims of nature and the limitations of its agricultural system. Now, with all these challenges, it might seem like the ancient Egyptians had a pretty rough time in the food department. But how did they actually overcome these challenges? Let's talk about how food was managed, stored, and even used as a tool for power in ancient Egypt. Let's take a step back now and look at how the ancient Egyptians managed to keep their food supply running, even in the face of all these challenges. Despite the limitations of their environment and the unpredictability of the Nile floods, they had some clever systems in place to store, preserve, and distribute food. One of the most important strategies the Egyptians used was food storage. The ancient Egyptians were masters at preserving grains, which made up the foundation of their diet. They built large granaries to store surplus grain from good years, which could then be used during times of famine or food scarcity. These granaries were often placed near the temples, which gave them a religious significance as well as a practical one. They served as not only food stores but also symbols of the pharaoh's ability to provide for the people. These grain stores were vital during periods of poor flooding when the agricultural yields were low. Historians debate just how effective these grain reserves were, but it's believed that they helped stabilize the food supply to some extent, particularly for the lower classes. In fact, records from ancient Egypt show that the pharaohs and their officials would sometimes distribute grain during times of crisis. This was more than just an act of charity, it was a way for the ruling class to maintain power and control over the people. By providing food, the pharaohs ensured that the population remained loyal and that there was a sense of stability, even in difficult times. But it wasn't just grain that was preserved. The Egyptians also had methods for storing other foods like fish and meat. Fish, for example, was dried or salted to keep it from spoiling in the hot, dry climate. Meat was smoked or dried, although it was much less common for ordinary people to have access to it regularly. They also used fermentation to preserve foods, including their famous beer, which could be kept for long periods without refrigeration. The use of food as a tool of power didn't stop with storage. It extended into the pharaoh's feasts and offerings. As we've seen, food was an essential part of religious life, and the pharaohs used feasts to showcase their wealth, their divine favor, and their ability to provide. These grand banquets were not just for pleasure, they were political tools that reinforced the pharaoh's status as the provider of life and sustenance for the people. A lavish feast was a display of the pharaoh's power over the land and the food supply. Historians still debate the extent to which the pharaoh's distribution of food was altruistic or politically motivated. But one thing is certain, food was both a necessity and a tool in ancient Egypt, used to maintain order, power, and stability in the face of uncertain conditions. The people of Egypt were at the mercy of nature, but their ingenuity in food storage and preservation helped them survive even the harshest times. So, after all this talk about how food was stored, managed, and used as power, you might be wondering, what was the real impact of these limitations and systems on the average Egyptian's life? Let's take a final look at how the diet of the ancient Egyptians shaped their society, their culture, and their daily existence. As we approach the end of this journey through ancient Egyptian cuisine, let's zoom out and reflect on how their food choices and systems shaped their society. Ancient Egypt was a land of contrasts, and food was one of the key factors that divided the rich from the poor. While the elite enjoyed lavish banquets filled with fine meats, fruits, and wine, the majority of Egyptians lived off the bare essentials: bread, beer, and whatever small rations they could scrape together. This disparity in food access wasn't just about nutrition, it was a reflection of the broader social hierarchies that defined life in Egypt. For the average Egyptian, the diet was simple, functional, and dictated by necessity. Their meals were designed to sustain them through the long days of hard work, but they didn't offer much in terms of pleasure or indulgence. The workers who toiled on the grand construction projects, such as the pyramids, had limited options. They relied heavily on grains, fish, and occasional meat, but this was far from a feast. This disparity between the elite and the working class was not just a reflection of wealth but of power. The pharaohs controlled the food supply, and by doing so, they maintained their hold over the entire kingdom. But food in ancient Egypt wasn't just about class and power. It was also deeply tied to their culture, spirituality, and daily rituals. Meals weren't just meals, they were acts of devotion and connection to the divine. Offerings to the gods, sacrifices at temples, and the idea that food could sustain the soul in the afterlife were all integral to Egyptian life. Even the simplest meal of bread and beer carried with it a deeper meaning, a connection to the gods and the eternal cycle of life and death. Looking back, the ancient Egyptians had a deeply ingrained understanding of the importance of food, not just as sustenance, but as something that transcended the physical. Meals were tied to their beliefs, their survival, and their place in the grand scheme of things. They made the best of what they had, creating systems for preserving food, using it for spiritual purposes, and ensuring their survival during tough times. And yet, when we think about ancient Egypt today, we often romanticize their feasts, their wealth, and their power. But when you strip away the layers of history, what remains is a people who worked hard for their food, who lived through the unpredictability of nature, and who saw food as more than just a way to fill their bellies, but as a means of connecting with something much larger than themselves. Now, as you wind down from this historical meal, let the final imagery of ancient Egypt settle in. Imagine the simplicity of their bread, the fullness of their beer, and the weight of their beliefs wrapped around every meal. And as the world spins on today, the ancient Egyptians remind us that food isn't just something to consume, it's a reflection of our culture, our struggles, and our connection to the world around us.